the bowling was being opened by Bob Hawke and Jenny George, and you have Bill Kelly keeping wickets, and you have Tim Fallis and Doug Cameron in first and second slip. And where's the Prime Minister? He's been consigned to fine leg. And don't you feel lonely, Laurie? You will have to bring out the drinks. But Mr. Speaker, I mean, one of the interesting things in life, of course, one of the interesting things in life is to study people's self-descriptions. I always find, as I'm sure many other members of the House find, I'm sure they always find self-portraits and self-descriptions as being very revealing. They are revealing not only of delusions, but they are also revealing of vulnerabilities. And, you know, the Prime Minister has his own sort of self-description, and I think I've got it right when the Prime Minister says, well, you know, they may think I'm a bit arrogant, they may think I'm a smidgen out of touch, but, gee, you know, despite all of that, I do get the mail through. I mean, this is the self-portrait he paints of himself. I may be a bit arrogant, grant that, but, gee, I get things done and I get the mail through. And I think that reveals both a vulnerability and it also reveals a delusion, because the great delusion this Prime Minister has is that in some way he does get the mail through. People often say to me, I want to vote against the Prime Minister because he's arrogant. And I say to them, don't vote against the Prime Minister because he's arrogant, vote against the Prime Minister because he's been a failure. Because the real reason why this man should be voted out of office, the real reason why his government should be voted out of office is that this government has been a failure. And those on the other side may use their noise, they may use their numbers, they may use anything they like in order to interject and to cry down what I'm saying. But the reality, Mr. Speaker, is unquestionably that it is not the arrogance of the Prime Minister that deserves censure, much that there is a lot of that, but the reason that he deserves censure is that he's been a failure as the Prime Minister of this country. And that is the reason why he deserves. And you asked why I put that proposition, Mr. Speaker. Let us look at unemployment. I mean, if ever there was a social concern that you would think a Labor government would want to have the most pristine credentials on of all, it would be unemployment. I mean, aren't you ashamed that after 13 years unemployment is now going up again towards 9%? Aren't you ashamed that youth unemployment sits now at 30%? Aren't you ashamed, despite all the talk about turning corners and bringing home the bacon, and this is the one that's going to deliver it all, despite all of that talk, you still have a situation where the unemployment rate in this country is starting to rise again, that we still have almost 1 in 3 of Australian young people who want to get a job can't get a job. Is that the sort of legacy that you want to take to the true believers in an electorate like Hughes? Is that the sort of legacy you want to take to Labor voters in other parts of the Australian community? Of course it isn't. And then, of course, we get to the Prime Minister's sort of piece de resistance, and that is the current account deficit. Of all of the extravagant claims that the Prime Minister, he says, here I go, what can I tell you? I'll be going a lot more on the current account deficit between now and the election. If you think you've heard the last about the current account deficit, now wasn't it in 1986, that Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister said, that if you know, we have a current account deficit, which now is much worse than what it was then, we'd be headed towards becoming a banana republic, and we now have the current account deficit that is the worst in the OECD. It is worse even than Mexico. We have a foreign debt that's risen from $23 billion in 1983 to $180 billion today. We have interest rates. Australia has amongst the highest real interest rates in the world. Inflation is now at 5.1%, which is one of the highest in the OECD area. Economic growth, very interesting, Mr. Speaker. The Business Council today has produced an analysis of the Australian economy, which has recorded, and I quote from the analysis, and this has come out only today, the lowest average growth rate for a 5-year period since at least 1960. So you have to go back 35 years to find an average growth rate over a period of 5 years, which is lower than the growth rate of the last 5 years. And also significantly, that same report demonstrated that in terms of national income per capita, Australia in the international rankings has fallen from 10th in 1983 to 22nd, Mr Speaker, from 10th in 1983 to 22nd in 1995. Now, if the government and the Prime Minister want to take that kind of economic record to the Australian people, if they want to campaign on that, if they think that is as good as it's ever going to get, if they believe that nobody has any reason to complain or object about that, well, I could say, and all of my colleagues on this side of the House could simply say, oh, that we could be so lucky, that people could be so deluded about their own performance, they could be so out of touch with what Australian people think at the present time that they could believe that that is the kind of thing that is going to secure them election. But the other reason, apart from his economic failure, Mr Speaker, that I believe the Prime Minister deserves to be censured by this House is his failure to uphold appropriate ministerial standards. His absolute failure to sack Carmen Lawrence for having deceitfully misled the Australian people. I mean, it really is a remarkable party. They throw Graham Campbell out for saying what he believes. They keep Carmen Lawrence for lying about what she's done.
Order.
Now, that is a very strange...
No. The League Opposition will withdraw that last comment and replace it with other words.
Well, Mr Speaker, if you ask me, they throw Graham Campbell out for saying what he believes. They keep Carmen Lawrence in for deceiving the Australian public about what she has done. And everybody on this side of the House and everybody out in the Australian community knows that if the Prime Minister had the standards of Gough Whitlam, if he'd had the standards of Ben Chifley, if he'd had the standards of Malcolm Fraser or Bob Hawke, he would have had the courage to sack Carmen Lawrence. And you know, he parades this fiction, he parades this myth, Mr Speaker, that in some way it's been a conspiracy of the Liberal Party. Just remember, Mr Speaker, I mean, he talks about the Burke Squad, he talks about the conspiracy, but everybody knows that Carmen Lawrence burnt not because of the Liberal Party, she burnt not because of Richard Court or anybody on this side of the House, she burnt because her Labor colleagues in Western Australia, the old Burke Squad, could no longer maintain their conspiracy of silence. And if it hadn't been for the fact that Keith Wilson spoke to Paul McGeoch of the Sydney Morning Herald in April of this year, if it hadn't been for the fact that all of her colleagues lined up to give evidence against her, if it hadn't been for the fact that Jim McGuinty, one of them, who actually told the Prime Minister that Carmen Lawrence was deceiving the Australian public, he warned the Prime Minister not to back Carmen Lawrence. In other words, he told the Prime Minister that he'd be sending good taxpayers' money after bad if he promised to pay the cost of Carmen Lawrence. If it hadn't been for the actions of those people, all of whom are members of the Australian Labor Party, then Carmen Lawrence would not now be in the predicament that she's in. She's there because she was exposed as being deceitful and dishonest by her own former Cabinet colleagues in Western Australia. She was undone by her own deceit. She was undone by her own dishonesty. She was undone by her own deception. It was Labor mates. It was the Burke Squad. It was all of those who brought her down. Nobody else. And this man sitting opposite stands condemned for not upholding the standards of Prime Minister ought to demand. And it is a mark of the standards that he's had. It is a mark of his failure to set those standards as a Prime Minister, which is one of the other reasons why he should be censured. Mr Speaker, I hope in a sense that the Prime Minister was right when he said we'll be coming back next year, but I don't think we will, and I look forward very, very much to the coming encounter in the election campaign.
Is the motion seconded? The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, 3 times.